We're here today at Trinity College, Cambridge, to meet the eminent academic, Professor Sir Simon Baron-Cohen. Sir Simon is a world expert on autism, a Cambridge professor and director of the university's influential Autism Research Centre. He lectures all over the world and has written a number of best-selling books on autism, including Mindblindness, 0 Degrees of Empathy and Pattern Seekers. The Lancet described him as a man with extraordinary knowledge, but his passionate advocacy for a more tolerant, diverse society where difference is respected and cultivated reveals a very human side to his science. It's a privilege to be here today to talk to him about his work. So Simon, can we start by you, I suppose, explaining a little bit about your scientific background? Maybe why did you get into psychology?
Right. So currently I'm the director of the Autism Research Centre here at Cambridge University. But 40 years ago, I was a teacher in an autistic school, a school for autistic kids.
In Cambridge, in London?
No, this was in North London. It was a really unusual environment because there were just 6 children and 6 teachers. So the very pioneering kind of experimental head teacher had opened up this unit for autistic kids at a time when we didn't know much about how to teach them and what their needs might be. So it was one-to-one. It's a great opportunity for me to just get to know the kids, get to know their families. It was called the family tree, so parents were very welcomed in.
And was this funded by a London Education Authority, or was it independent?
Yeah, it was funded by, I think, Barnet.
Okay.
It's up in North London. But as a kind of very experimental school, the head teacher had put video cameras in every classroom.
Wow.
So that we could go back at the end of the day and sort of review what had gone well with the kids and what hadn't gone well, just to try and sort of understand more about how to meet these children's needs. And at the end of that year, I thought, I'm going to go off and do a PhD, and found Uta Frith.
So had you studied psychology at university? Or?
Yeah, so I studied something called human sciences at Oxford, and psychology was certainly part of that. And, you know, we're talking about, you know...
a few years ago now.
This was 1981. You know, when autism was not really a household word, which it is today, which is really good.
Because Uta, I think, I'm sort of going to suggest that in the olden days, probably in that period, people put autism down to parenting, cold parenting, something along those lines.
Yeah,
and
there'd been this theory that autism was caused by the parents and not providing a sort of warm emotional environment in which the child would learn to develop socially and emotionally. So that was associated with a man called Bruno Bettelheim. And that was sort of a theory in the 1970s, really. Even earlier, perhaps. But by the time I came along into this field, people were questioning that theory. It wasn't yet firmly established that autism was genetic, or partly genetic, which we now know it is, because autism runs in families.
So is it a sort of nature via nurture thing? I mean, the environment does play a part, or is it?
Well, I mean, to the extent that genes always operate in an environment, so there's always an interaction with your experience. But what we now know is that autism runs in families, as I say. So there is a genetic predisposition. And I think having a biomedical perspective on autism meant that the parents could actually finally feel relieved that they weren't being blamed for why their child was different. You know, none of us are responsible for our genes or for the genes that our children inherit. But the key thing is to just recognise what do children need and what's the best way to meet those needs.
And when you were, would have been at UCL, so the diagnosis rates, they've changed considerably. Can you enlighten us on those?
So back then, so we're talking the 1980s, about 4 in 10,000 was what all the textbooks said.
Wow.
So autism was considered to be very rare.
Very rare.
Today, if we fast forward, 40 years, it's now considered to be very common, 1 in 36. So that's estimated to be a 700% increase in prevalence just since the year 2000. So it's absolutely sort of skyrocketing.
And in your view, is
Yeah.
that something to do with correctly diagnosing people now that previously hadn't been diagnosed? Or
It's a number of different things. So one thing is that in the mid-90s, the classification system opened up a new category called Asperger's syndrome,
yes.
which many of you will have heard of, many of
Yeah.
your listeners. And Asperger's syndrome was autism without learning disability. So before that, most of the kids or adults who were getting a diagnosis of autism not only were autistic but also had learning disability. And then after the mid-90s, just very incrementally, people in the mainstream population, in the general population, started wondering, I wonder if I'm autistic, or I wonder if my son or my daughter is autistic, even if they'd not had any learning disability. And so that kind of opened up autism to the wider population. And then, of course, what happened in the early 2000s was social media and the internet. So suddenly autistic people were finding each other online.
Yeah.
They were starting to create forums where they could talk to each other. So just the concept of autism started taking off. And I think where we are today, autism is now close to 3% of the population. I think that's a really good thing, because there must have been lots of people in the old days who were struggling, didn't know why they were different, but now there's a name for it.
So allow me to sort of unpick some of the terms. So being on the autistic spectrum,
Yeah.
do we still talk about the fact that there is a spectrum?
Yeah.
Asperger's, is it still considered to be a condition, or is it now?
Right.
And the whole neurodiversity idea,
Okay.
where do the three of these things sort of fit?
Okay. So the spectrum is still very much a concept that people find useful. It was originally introduced by Lorna Wing, who was a psychiatrist working in South London at the Institute of Psychiatry. And that was, in the 1980s. So it was the idea that rather than autism just being all or none, a very binary thing, maybe there are kind of degrees of autism and different combinations of characteristics. And that, again, opened up the category of autism to many more people. So that's one thing. I think the second thing you asked about was Asperger's syndrome. So that name, it was kind of useful for about a decade, maybe a bit longer. And first of all, the American Psychiatric Association decided in 2013 to remove it as an available diagnosis because clinicians weren't using it consistently. So there was a question about its reliability. In 2018, the journal that I was editor of published an article showing that Hans Asperger, the paediatrician after whom that category was named, had collaborated with the Nazis.
Oh, I see.
And so suddenly, this was during the war, the Second World War, and in fact had gone a bit further in referring children to euthanasia clinics, compulsory euthanasia clinics. So, so suddenly the term Asperger's syndrome was questionable.
I had no idea.
Yeah. So nowadays we just use the umbrella concept of autism.
Yes.
But it's a very broad umbrella.
So neurodiversity, that fits in with the spectrum idea?
I think it does. Neurodiversity kind of had its own history as a term. So it was coined, people claim, by an autistic woman called Judy Singer in Australia, I think in the late 90s. And it's gradually sort of taken off as a concept.
It really has, yeah.
But neurodiversity is much broader than autism. It's the idea that all of our brains are different. Sometimes those differences are to do with disability. Autism would be one, ADHD might be another, dyslexia, dyspraxia, the list goes on. So kind of different strengths and challenges. But if you take it one step further, you'd simply say all of our brains are different just like all of our bodies are different. And that I suppose kind of ethically and, from a humanitarian perspective, making space for people to just be who they are, kind of accepting difference, as opposed to the old days where difference might have been stigmatized. If you think about how learning disability was once something that was in society was felt as shameful for families or for individuals. What we hope is that we've moved a long way since those days to recognizing that difference is the norm. We're all different. And it's really down to the education system and other agencies in society to make space for all those differences.
Well, you have played a key role as a great science communicator to, I suppose, open up the discussion about autism to a much, much wider audience. So thank you on behalf of all those people that enjoy a bit of popular science.
Right.
Can I just make reference to a couple of observations that you've made, certainly in the essential difference?
Right.
I don't know if you know this, but you often talk in threes. Sorry, making this. So you had 3 letters in the essential difference, and you've got 3 words in the pattern seekers.
Right.
So in the essential difference,
so you talk about. You've typecast me as a
3-person.
A 3-person.
Trinity. You have the Trinity. So in the essential difference, you talk about the letters S, E, and B. I think.
Right. Yeah.
And in the pattern seekers, you talk about, I think it's if and then.
Okay. You want me to elaborate?
Yeah, do you mind? Just
So this book, The Essential Difference, it was looking at the psychology of gender, of boys and girls, men and women, just on average, when you take groups of males, groups of females, and it was kind of recasting how we think about gender differences, average gender differences, in terms of females developing better empathy on average, so that's E, and males having a stronger interest in systems of one kind or another, so that's the S. And you mentioned B, that's where the individuals might be much more balanced, sort of equally interested in people's emotions and taking other people's perspectives as they are in objects and how they work, or systems and how they work. So that book kind of explored a new theory of can we look at neurodiversity in the population in terms of people who lean more towards understanding people or who lean more towards understanding systems. Systems being things like, the world of machines or maps or mathematics or music. They're not necessarily animate, but they are lawful, and you need a different kind of way of processing information to understand systems versus people.
And this isn't a sort of deterministic argument. This isn't you're always going to be a system person or you're always going to be an empathetic person.
No. I mean, otherwise there'd be no role for education.
Blend them together, I suppose, for a more balanced one, or celebrate that.
Yeah, and education and practice gives you opportunity to strengthen certain areas if that's what you want. But what we were finding is that when you just do big studies, for example, looking at empathy versus systemizing, you do find this consistent gender difference on average. It doesn't apply to individuals because an individual may not be typical for their gender, but that more girls and women show a stronger interest in people, and more boys and men show a stronger interest in things and how they work.
So did you develop those ideas when you were talking about pattern seekers? Because pattern seekers, you've gone a little bit further.
Yeah.
You're talking now about this idea that possibly autism as a condition has some evolutionary advantage, or this idea of unpicking things, maybe in a pattern
absolutely.
seeker.
So, I mean, it goes back to this idea that we mentioned earlier that autism is partly genetic. So our brains are partly genetically determined or selected, if you like, in evolution. And the question is, if there are a group of people in the population who love understanding how things work, might that have had an advantage in evolutionary time? And what the book does, The Pattern Seekers, is it looks at how humans uniquely have been able to invent in a very generative way for the last 100,000 years.
So the example that I seem to remember was planting crops.
Okay.
Can you take me through that one?
Yeah.
It needed somebody to sort of go, I have this thing called a seed.
Yeah.
If I put it in this thing called soil, and if it rains and if it's sunny,
Yeah.
then something will happen.
Yeah, so that is a nice example of this if and then logic, which I think uniquely humans can do, modern Homo sapiens can do, and other animals don't do. That's the thesis in the book. And autistic people seem to be particularly fascinated by these patterns, these if and then patterns. So if I take a tomato seed and put it in moist ground, then I get a tomato plant. So it's if and then. And that very simple algorithm gave rise to the agricultural revolution, which has transformed our health and the way we live. So that's just one example. Another example might be the earliest musical instrument that's ever been found.
Which is?
Well, it was a flute. I went to the small museum in Germany near the cave where it was found.
Oh, wow.
But it's 40,000 years old, and it's a flute made from a hollow bone from a bird. It's actually about the size of your little finger.
Wow.
But it's got little holes in it, and archaeologists have
Played it.
they've played it. They've also kind of inferred that this was a musical instrument.
Wow.
And that if you imagine the ancestor of ours who invented this early musical instrument, it would have been something like, if I blow down the hollow bone, it makes a particular noise. If I cover one hole, it makes a different noise. So it's if and then, So it's kind of how we invent complex tools like a musical instrument or like music itself as a system of notes.
So how in your opinion can we apply, I suppose, you definitely feel that there is something very special about people that have autism, and you definitely talk in Pattern Seekers again about certain institutions, certain organisations that are seeing the strengths.
Yeah.
I seem to remember maybe even in Cambridge, chocolate factory or something. Is that...
Well, we'll come on to employment in a second, but I suppose what I do in the Pattern Seekers in this book is say, well, rather than expect all children to be interested in people and systems, if there are some children who feel very confused or overwhelmed or stressed by the world of people, but they find it really comforting and engaging to get immersed in the world of systems, let them take things apart, let them explore how things work, play to the child's strengths. Because that might be an important stepping stone into the world of employment a bit later. So, I suppose historically, autistic children were, they were being kind of pressurized, even sort of, coerced into being sociable. If you think about the classroom design in mainstream schools.
Group work a lot of.
Yeah, you're expected to be a team player.
You are, yeah.
You're expected to look at the teacher's face and read his or her emotions, listen to their tone of voice. For some autistic children...
You just want to build Lego Meccano.
It could be building, or it could be learning from computers or learning from books, but where the information is a bit more static, it's not kind of rapidly changing. In a social situation, things are happening so fast, it's sometimes hard to process the information. Whereas, if you're building something out of Lego, you're in control of the sequence, the design, the structure. You can sort of check and recheck exactly what's going on, and that might suit a pattern-seeking kind of mind. And if you set things up in the right way so that a child with that kind of mind has the best chance of learning, so optimal conditions for that kind of mind, really sort of links with this concept of neurodiversity. Other children might feel much more comfortable in small groups chatting, but these particular children might be more comfortable either learning in a solitary way or learning in their own, following their own interests.
And we shouldn't shy away from that as educators.
Not at all, because the goal, of course, in education is to have children who are self-confident and who are enjoying learning. The goal is not the 3 R's, get them to achieve certain grades in certain curricula. The goal is happy children who are kind of following what they're interested in, because then they're going to be sort of motivated and passionate to go on to either further study or to the world of work. But also, most importantly, feeling good about themselves. And, I know that Learnus is very, focused on how can we take the neuroscience and the science of psychology and education to really help the science of teaching. And what concerns me a lot is that when we look at autistic children, many of them are dropping out of school, underachieving, developing poor mental health. Shockingly, 1 in 4 autistic people plan or attempt suicide.
Wow.
So it's very telling that they're looking around the world and they're thinking, do I really fit in this world? And do I feel welcome in this world? So something from the moment of their birth through to when they can really think about their future, in their teens, for example, something's going dreadfully wrong in that period.
And this is work that the Autism Research Centre has come up with. This is data that you I heard you talk at the House of Lords actually for the Learnus event, and you were referencing some policy decisions that were made 2014, I think. Has there been any?
So in 2014 we published the first big study of suicidality in autistic people, and here we are in 2024. Not much has improved. So back then we were showing, that 1 in 3, 1 in 4 autistic people have planned or attempted suicide. Actually, something like 2/3 of autistic people have felt suicidal, but going that extra step of actually planning it or attempting it. Still shockingly high rates.
Really high.
And we published the paper in a prestigious journal called the Lancet Psychiatry. And we did it really as a wake-up call to the government, saying if you leave a group of people without a diagnosis, because this was a study in adults coming to a clinic for the first time, without support, look at what happens. And we hoped that they would take the research and change policy. But 10 years later, the situation is just as dire. We are pleased that in the latest suicide prevention plan that the government has released, that autism is now recognised as a high-risk group. So that's at least something. But we need to go a lot further than that.
If I can be a little bit cheeky, have you got 3 ideas that you would really want to promote?
Let's do things in threes. That's
well,
good.
I'm sort of thinking more specific, I suppose, in terms of sort of education, because as you quite rightly point out, if you let somebody get to an adult before diagnosing it, no wonder they're going to feel a little bit isolated and lonely. But I suppose if you can pick something up in
let's we can sort of think about what are the 3 big things that teachers or educators should be thinking about. The first is, if you've got a child who is different, celebrate that difference. So that, because if the goal is to ensure that their self-esteem is being maintained or even sort of nurtured, then if the child is not fitting into the typical pattern of development, they're a bit different. Rather than that being a source of maybe a cause of being bullied, which is often the case. Children who are different are often bullied. Maybe kind of change the lens so that child feels that they can teach other children, that they can that you can sort of celebrate their strengths, their gifts, which are there if you bother to look. So that might be one thing. But the second thing is to kind of ask the child, what do they need? Because what we're increasingly realizing is that many autistic children, even before they get their diagnosis, are hiding their difference. So even though we might talk about inclusion, children don't necessarily feel confident to say, I'm struggling. So kind of if teachers and parents are bothering to sit down with the child at the end of the day and just find out, how was your day at school and what do you need? Children might open up a bit, and that's very important. But I suppose the last thing is about number 3, is about sort of, we do need much more in the way of support services. And it might be at school, it might be after school clubs, but if a child is becoming withdrawn and isolated and they're not happy about being isolated, we just need support services that will connect the child to feel a sense of belonging.
So there have been some success stories. A while ago I did reference the chocolate factory in Cambridge.
Yeah.
So there have been groups that have celebrated.
Well, I mean, if we sort of jump ahead to what happens to autistic people when they become adults, the National Autistic Society, their figures suggest that 85% of autistic adults are unemployed. So we've got individuals we mentioned earlier who might be really talented at understanding how things work. At home they might be taking things apart, reassembling them, maybe even designing things themselves. But on paper they don't have educational qualifications, many of them. And even if they do apply for jobs, they're not getting through interviews, not being shortlisted, maybe because they don't have the social skills of how you have to present yourself to an employer. So this particular company, they're called Harry Specter's. It's just a family business which makes chocolates.
Right.
But
in Cambridge?
Well, it's close to Cambridge, yeah. They only employ autistic people. It turns out that cooking, whether it's chocolates or anything else, involves rules and patterns. If you think about following a recipe, and you can do it very precisely and you can get an excellent result, if and then, if I take this kind of ingredient and I cook it at this temperature, add these various different ingredients, then I get a particular... And Harry Specter's is producing chocolates at the high end of the market, and that's fantastic. But it's just providing employment for autistic people who might otherwise be unemployed. And
in a sense celebrating their specific skill set, I suppose.
Yeah. We had an event here in Cambridge yesterday where a man called Jim Hogan came to speak. He's autistic. He's head of innovation at Google. But as a child, people thought that he didn't really have a future. So it's just about giving people a chance. He was clearly fascinated by systems and how they work, and he got the opportunity, and he's now become...
He's made a living out of it.
Well, he's become a champion for neurodiversity at work. So it's about giving people a chance to shine.
Are you able to speak a little bit about the whole idea of autism as being a separate sort of entity, I suppose distinct from some other sort of conditions? I suppose within education we often sort of go, okay, that's an autistic child, or that's somebody with ADHD or something.
Right.
And in my head, I'm sort of now thinking, well, it's probably more complicated than that. It's a bit more nuanced than the fact that this is an autistic child, therefore needs to be.
Yeah.
Or can you speak to that just a little bit?
Sure. There's some research which shows that, on average, autistic people don't just have one diagnosis. They might have as many as 6 diagnoses.
Oh, really?
So autism is one. You mentioned ADHD. Some other diagnoses might be dyslexia, dyscalculia, dyspraxia, maybe sensory issues, maybe mental health issues. So it is important to sort of not assume that all autistic children or people are the same, and not to focus on just the single diagnosis. If you're trying to meet the needs of that child, you need to sort of look at the whole child. If you focused on, their challenges with social skills and communication, that might be kind of missing the fact that they're also anxious and depressed. So you need to kind of meet all of those needs.
I suppose, sort of finally, how optimistic are you that the world is actually starting to understand, take on board this sort of... I'm going to reference a TV programme, very, very funny, called Dinosaurs. And it's sort of... The central character has autism and is very entertaining, very insightful, very interesting, and you really feel very sympathetic.
Right.
Are you feeling reasonably confident that we in this country, I suppose, have started to embrace the needs, I suppose, or understanding that some structures might need to be changed slightly, as in institutional structures.
Yeah. I do have some optimism.
Okay.
Because I think you're absolutely right that if we look around at television, and we were talking earlier about festivals like the Edinburgh Festival. These days you'll come across autistic people who are putting on shows talking about their autism. There's a lot more kind of openness about just kind of raising awareness about difference and people welcoming that. So I think things are improving.
There's a but coming.
Well, I'll be happy when I see the employment rates going up,
yes,
and the suicide rates coming down. And those are kind of more objective markers, if you like, that the world is not only being more accepting, but really reaching out to people who are different to say, come and join us.
Are they employment rates going up and suicide rates coming down, or is it pretty much static since 2014? Or is no one looking?
I think we need to sort of keep monitoring these rates. So there's probably an argument for a charity like yours, to be keeping track of whether these statistics are moving in the right direction. Are we moving the needle over time? And
finally, I suppose the centre, the Autism Research Centre.
Yeah.
What's the direction of travel for that? What exciting things have you got?
So what we try to do is balance basic science, where we're trying to understand, for example, differences in the brain using MRI, differences in genetics, differences in the biology of autism and the psychology of autism. That's kind of the basic science. We try and balance it with what we call applied research. So looking at what is useful for autistic people and their families, whether it's evaluating new interventions. We've got a big trial of music therapy going on at the moment, because the argument is that for some children, autistic children, who don't necessarily enjoy verbal communication, just coming into the room with a music therapist and being able to pick up an instrument. We talked earlier about a flute, but it could be anything, without necessarily needing to talk. The music therapist, creates one rhythm or riff, and the child might respond, and it's kind of a back and forth and building trust and communication. I think the research needs to always be looking what might be helpful for autistic people and their families.
Well, can I thank you on behalf of Learnus? Really, really interesting, and hopefully I'll be able to come back in 5 years' time. We can catch up again.
That'd be good.
Find out what else is happening. And on behalf of Learnus again, thank you very much for your great speech at the House of Lords. It was, very interesting.
Delighted, thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Sir Simon Baron-Cohen founded the Autism Research Centre at the University of Cambridge in 1997 and has been director of the centre ever since. Today we are fortunate to be meeting Dr. Elizabeth Weir, who is one of the research associates at the Autism Research Centre. She's also a BI-fellow at Queen's College here in Cambridge. Her research focuses primarily on the outcomes of autistic people in the areas of health, healthcare, educational attainment and employment. Elizabeth, lovely to see you, and thank you very much for giving up your precious time for us today. So you've ended up in this place called the Autism Research Centre. Are you able to give us some sort of insights, how long it's been going? I know that Professor Simon Baron-Cohen is coordinating everything there, but what about its size? What sort of things is it researching at the moment?
Yeah, so it's a really diverse kind of centre, multidisciplinary in nature, which is really unique. Mm-hmm. So the whole thing is focused on autism, it's in the name, but thinking about it both from a basic science perspective as well as an applied research perspective. So that includes things on the basic science side, like understanding genetics or neuroimaging. It involves using kind of a wide range of different methods, as well as thinking about psychology and behavior, all of those kinds of things. And then the applied side of things would think about things like health of autistic people, employment, education, their engagement with the criminal justice system. It's a huge,
Very
huge
diverse,
range.
yes.
Yeah, and
so
of different methods.
How many people are involved?
Well, so I'm not sure of the exact number now, but it's definitely north of 35,
Wow.
maybe even 40 or 45 people that work there.
And your side of the research at the moment is very specific, or you're involved in quite a few different things?
So it's interesting. I think I sort of sit in a funny position because I touch on a bit of the basic side as well as the applied research. So most of my
I like
research...
the fact you're talking some of the basic side, and neuroimaging becomes basic. To me, that's like, wow, science.
Yeah, well, and I mean, when we say basic science, we don't mean straightforward or easy or anything like that. Just kind of, getting at the heart of it. So so some of the work that I do thinks about like co-occurring health conditions, for example. And so you could think about how that could apply, kind of thinking about what the reasons might be for that on a biological level, but also what that's like for quality of life and what other reasons, social factors might be. So, how is your communication with your healthcare provider? Things like that can also have an impact on your health. So I kind of sit across both of those areas because I'm thinking a lot about education, about health, and doing some work on mental health and suicide prevention as well.
Can we go into that in a little bit more detail, especially obviously education? Learnus, the think tank that we're sort of here representing, is very interested in building these bridges between the academics and the practitioners. Is there anything that I suppose you could sort of reveal to us educators about autism and how people feel that have autism? I know you could talk about the statistics, I suppose, about suicide that Simon talked about earlier, which are quite scary, really.
Yeah, they are. They're very concerning, for researchers, for people who are autistic themselves, for their family members and friends. I mean, we know from a really, really kind of robust study, it's called a meta-analysis, which basically takes data from dozens of different studies from across the globe, and they found that 1 in 4 autistic adults attempts suicide, which is a really alarming number for us. And actually, based on a lot of the work that was done at the Autism Research Centre and with other collaborators around the UK and around the world, the UK government has now changed, or kind of added, I should say, autistic people as one of the kind of key priority groups for suicide prevention here in the UK. So, I think it's been quite difficult that we've not made as much progress on suicide prevention as we'd like to have done. But I also think it's a great thing to see that the government's really paying attention and really listening to what research is telling us.
Any insights into, I suppose, more primary aged young people or secondary aged young people, or is it something similar?
Yeah, so we don't have really specific statistics, but we know that even younger adolescents and children might be at a higher risk of suicide who are autistic, which is really concerning to us. So we're doing some new research to look into that. But also just thinking about the high rates of mental health conditions. So if we think even autistic children, the best estimates we have are that over 60, maybe even 70% of autistic children have a co-occurring mental health condition, like anxiety, depression.
So this is autism plus another condition, or 2 or 3 other conditions.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you can imagine how that impacts on someone's whole life. It impacts on their education, it impacts on their health, their well-being, kind of every aspect of things. So we need to consider that.
Do you sort of have a message, I suppose, to teachers, primary teachers, secondary teachers, about somebody with autism?
Well, I think one of the things is trying to be on the lookout, right, for children who might be in need of support and might not be recognized. So one of the main things that we know is that a lot of kids, particularly young women and girls, go unrecognized for a really long period of time. And I think that's a real area that teachers can make a big change, a big difference in someone's life.
Yeah, there's definitely a stereotype, I think, in my head, and probably a lot of other teachers, that autism really is just a male condition, so to speak.
Yeah, and that's really not the case. I think the research on that, the amount of girls getting diagnosed has changed a lot over time. So there was a recent study that came out that showed actually almost an 800% increase in diagnosis across the last 20 years for autistic women and girls in the UK, based on NHS records. And that's really, we think, because we're changing we're better recognizing autism, I think. and also some of the diagnostic criteria has changed a bit. So that kind of accounts for that increase, but I think we're really just seeing a kind of catch up in a lot of the young women and girls who should have been diagnosed, but there's still a long way to go.
So what we probably need to do is look at some of the, I suppose from an autistic point of view, we need, as teachers and educators, we need to look at understanding what their skill set is and encouraging, I suppose, that sort of skill set. Sympathising, I suppose, because an understanding that actually you feel a bit different and you're not necessarily able to get on with groups of people in the same way. It sounds like I'm being a bit unfair there. So, that sort of inclusive, tolerant thing that we have.
Yeah, well, and I think there's a big shift, and this is something that we talk about a lot at the Autism Research Centre, this kind of shift towards a neurodiversity affirmative approach, which I think we're all very supportive of. And that's kind of the idea that every individual person, or people who are autistic, people who have ADHD, people who have mental health conditions, dyslexia, all kinds of different things, they might all have a different brain type. And every single brain type has kind of challenges, but also has strengths, just like every person you can think of. And so I think we want to recognize that all of those brain types are really valuable. And so if teachers can think about the value that each of their students brings, that they might have some challenges like any other person, but also are really going to have some areas in which the way they see things differently is beneficial. And I think we wouldn't all want to think the same way or approach problems in the same way. We wouldn't get very far. I
love the idea of neurodiversity. I mean, we are all different. The environment has been different to us. The genes have all been different to us. Probably therefore going to grow up all being a little bit different. A little bit more, if you will, about the research that you are currently doing or are looking forward to doing. What's the direction of travel, I think, for you and possibly not the Autism Research Centre, but certainly direction of travel for you as part of the Autism Research Centre?
Yeah, so I think there's a number of studies that we're hoping. I can't really talk much about the details of them.
Okay.
Well, I can tell you about the design. I can't tell you about the results from them yet. But I have a lot of work that's looking at data from the National Pupil Database.
Okay.
So that's looking at what's going on for millions of children across the UK.
Literally millions?
Literally,
wow.
Yeah. Almost 4 million kids.
Wow.
So we're looking
huge
at
database.
Yeah. So we're looking at kind of what the outcomes look like in regard to who kind of stays engaged with the education system. So there's a specific classification that's called becoming NEET. So that's not in employment, education or training. I know some teachers are probably familiar with that
very
as an
familiar.
idea. Yeah,
very.
And so we are interested in looking at, first of all, whether or not students with special educational needs are more likely to become NEET, but also what are the factors that contribute to the likelihood of becoming NEET. And really the idea of that kind of a project is to think about what are the ways that we could intervene as educators, politicians, parents, everyone thinking about what kinds of things can we push forward to make a change.
Is it a longitudinal study? You've been following people, have you?
Yeah, so we look at it's all anonymized data and it's all heavily protected.
Okay.
But it's basically I'm able to look at that anonymized data and track students from right when they start school at about age 5 all the way up till 18.
Wow. And that's going to be ongoing, obviously, now.
Yes, so we're hoping that results from that will come out soon, and it'll be a kind of set of studies telling us about what's going on for students with special educational needs.
We'll have to come back and interview you. You're going to have to come back and tell us all about it.
Yeah, and then some of the other work is thinking about co-occurring health conditions. So we know that autistic people are at higher risk of physical and mental health conditions. And so we're trying to understand what some of the reasons for that might be, and also what some of the specific conditions that they might have higher risk of, because we want autistic people to lead very happy, long lives. And so it's important that we're making sure we're taking care of other co-occurring things that might be more common. And then the last one is what we've been talking about, that suicide prevention research. So some of that work is going to be trying to create, in particular, sort of representative and national statistics on suicide among autistic people in the UK. And that'll be the first time that's actually been done using kind of data from all over the UK and kind of representative of everyone's demographics.
You have a lot to do, it seems, an
Yes.
awful lot to do. And you're feeling quite optimistic about, I suppose, people's sort of understanding of autism now. Is it getting out there into the sort of the cultural world, for want of a better term, or young people are starting to appreciate and understand neurodiversity in a way that maybe people of a different generation didn't understand it?
Yeah, I think there's a lot better recognition. And I think it's also great that we're talking about neurodiversity and moving away from some of the more harmful terminology that may have been used in the past, thinking about it. But I also think we have a long way to go, but I'm really hopeful that we're on the right trajectory and that we're figuring out ways to better support people regardless of what kind of brain type they might have.
Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you, Elizabeth, and you do have an awful lot of work to do, it seems. So you better stay in Cambridge for an awful long time.
Yeah, I'm hoping.
Okay. Thank you very much for giving us your time today and talking to us. It's been a pleasure.